Hello, I'm Ellen Bince, coming today from Wheaton, Illinois, in the USA. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson, coming today from Leigh-on-Sea in the UK. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of these regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something many of us may know only a little about and see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. And in fact, that's our topic for today.
Indeed.
And as we record, it's March 4th, 2025.
I'm really looking forward to this, partly because I think you and I potentially have slightly different understandings on where we are on our own journeys with this.
Yes, I think so.
Interesting. And probably there aren't absolute answers to it. So it's one of these sort of more exploratory topics, isn't it, really? Where we're
maybe posing some questions for our listeners to think about for their own journey.
Yes, absolutely. So we thought we'd take a little bit of a different approach this week to our normal deep dive into what's happening in the world, looking at something that's really fundamental about what the podcast is about, getting to the root of what we mean when we talk about intention and prayer. Now, as you know, if you're a regular listener, we tend, perhaps lazily sometimes, to use these terms interchangeably, but know that different folks have different understandings of what the terms mean. And depending on what this understanding is, the two aren't necessarily the same. So we thought we would attempt to explore some of these different understandings and see where what happens when we pray or hold intention may overlap. Now, for some folk, prayer and intention are very separate things. Indeed, we know one or two folks who don't like speaking about there being any association at all, particularly those who do not follow the teachings of a faith tradition, but who may work with energy, may relate more to the idea of intention. And conversely, some among those who believe that all prayer must be directed via God or a superior being may not readily entertain the idea that we have a power within us to direct the healing or well-being of others. Now, we, of course, respect these different points of view, but in this episode, I'm more interested in trying to disentangle some of the confusion that might exist for the many of us who sense that there is some kind of overlap, or indeed that very often we are talking about one and the same thing, whatever our worldviews and the words we use to describe our practice. So let's start as best we can with some possible definitions, albeit these are just among some fairly well-known definitions that are offered by some, as opposed to what may be universally accepted as being definitive. We're not sure that they fully get to the complete picture of what we're talking about, but they do give us at least some starting points to run with.
Right. So, firstly, intention. Lynn McTaggart, always one of our go-tos on intention work, given her many years of writing and hosting research in this field, points to a textbook definition of intention, which she says, quote, characterizes it as a powerful, purposeful plan to perform an action which will lead to a desired outcome. Unlike, she says, a desire, which means simply focusing on an outcome without a purposeful plan of how to achieve it. Commenting on the early research of scientists, including the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which will use the acronym IONS from now on, into the ability of consciousness to have an energetic impact, she writes, an intention was directed at the intender's own action. It required some sort of reasoning. It required a commitment to do the intended deed. Intention implied purposefulness, an understanding of a plan of action and a satisfactory result. To influence physical matter, what scientists at IONS and elsewhere believed, thought had to be highly motivated and targeted. Now, we have to admit that we're not fully comfortable with some of this. I'm pretty comfortable with it, but I think Clive's not comfortable with it.
I wrote those words, didn't
Yes.
I? It comes down to definitions, how we define things again, probably. And for me, a desire, this idea that Lynn comes up with, a desire is focused on an outcome. And this intention invariably involves having a plan to achieve an end. I guess maybe for me, it's echoing back to my corporate project management days when I had plans and goals and all that kind of thing, and a very clear idea of what I wanted to achieve. And maybe that's
Now,
why I
now,
follow it.
if she had said for the highest good, would that have changed it for you?
Well, I think it would have put a different emphasis on the desired
Mhm.
outcome, but I don't think still I could say I have a plan. I have an idea maybe of how this might be achieved as best I can, but I'm offering the desire for a change to come about to the high, to a higher power, essentially, to the energy, to kind of make the plan. It may well be beyond what I can imagine or is different to what I can imagine. And if I put too many restrictions around the route to get there, to get to that outcome, I think that's where I start to, as I say, it may just be me. I start to refer back to my worldly ways of managing projects or to-do lists and all that kind of thing, and having a very fixed idea
No.
about how to get there.
Right. And I think that this is why we're doing this episode, because
Mm,
of the words can really be trip you up, and we can get lost in the weeds in the words. And we know that people like Greg Braden and Joe Dispenza and some of these guys who are thought leaders, no pun intended, on this subject are talking about it really it's we're more effective when it becomes a feeling.
yes, exactly.
We take the emphasis off these
Yes.
words and we embody it in our heart as a feeling. So maybe as we as you said, disentangle these definitions, we're going to learn that we got to bring it down to the heart and not to the
I
brain.
think so. And it is tricky because we're trying to come up with some definitions that we can say, well, look,
Yeah.
this is maybe we can get a handle on this. But desire is definitely in that field for me. The idea of there being a clear focus at the end of it. Yes, there is, but you can almost, if you have the yearning, that's what comes first. The burning desire from deep within. That's what for me sends the vibration or
For the
initiates the
highest
vibration
good.
for the highest good.
For the highest good.
Or the highest good, exactly. And it comes sometimes without knowing how it's going to get there, but just the trust that it will. So you can, when you're in that space of feeling, you're not thinking about words. You're not thinking about how do I describe this necessarily. And it's not necessarily for me also associated with, a clear picture of the end result. So I think that's why I'm just a little bit not disagreeing. It's more not sure the definition quite gets there for me.
One place to start for us is to acknowledge that thoughts have energy.
Yes.
Our thoughts have energy. And we know that from, sacred texts that's been written. We also know that through science,
Mm,
through the Heart Math Institute's work, through Greg Braden's work. We're learning that thoughts have energy.
absolutely. I think for me, definitely that's true. And we could stop there and we could say, well, that is, absolutely intention of work. But I have a sense that if we do that and leave our kind of definition there, we're forgetting that we can also embrace heart energy and everything we talk about. Again, Heart Math Institute doing a lot of research about the power. We obviously talk about this as well, that is radiated from the heart space. And particularly when
And Heart Math has coined a term, energetic responsibility.
exactly.
We are energetically responsible for
Yes.
what we put out in the field.
Absolutely. So I think again that's where I'm feeling a little bit discomfort. It's not that I disagree, but I feel it's not necessarily getting the full picture around what intention can be if we restrict it to thought. That we can If we embrace the idea of the heart energy, the energy from within, in combination with what we're thinking,
Right.
then we've got for me, what feels a more satisfactory understanding. Now, the psychologist Wayne W. Dyer, who's author of the book The Power of Intention, notes that the traditional textbook understanding of what intention is, which he says is being a strong purpose or aim accompanied by a determination to produce a desired result. People driven by intention are described as having a strong will that won't permit anything to interfere with achieving their inner desire, he says. However, he does go on to say that my writing now emphasizes a belief that we can find spiritual solutions to problems by living at higher levels and calling upon faster energies. Again, his words, in my mind, intention is something much greater than a determined ego or individual will. It's something, this is interesting, almost totally opposite. Intention is not something you do, but rather a force that exists in the universe as an invisible field of energy. It's almost the opposite, where he's come to. He also cites from a book by the anthropologist Carlos Castaneda, The Active Side of Infinity, that recounts Castaneda's apprenticeship under Don Juan Matus, a Yaqui Indian sorcerer from Sonora, Mexico. Castaneda prefers that intent is a force that exists in the universe. When sorcerers, in other words, those who live of the source, beckon intent, it comes to them and sets up the path for attainment, which means that sorcerers always accomplish what they set out to do. Now, we'll come back to that idea a little bit later, which seems to position intention more closely with prayer than most of the standard dictionary definitions might suggest. And possibly if we follow Dyer's thinking in our preferred definition of intention, we might describe this as something like being a deep originating desire for movement in the universal field of consciousness, or if you prefer, divine conviction and movement, that is sensed by another being or life form. So simply put, this is what we want to happen and will to happen through this divine power, or if you prefer to see it as an invisible power or energetic field that vibrates throughout the cosmos. And that's actually where some of the scientific support can get really interesting in supporting that. We don't necessarily need to know what this is. For example, how what we will for interacts with universal consciousness, nor need to resort to the theories of quantum physics or otherwise to explain it. Interesting though this is to explore from time to time, and indeed to give some real backup. We certainly enjoy doing that and find it really fascinating and inspiring. But ultimately, we just need to accept something greater than what we can see, measure, or indeed adequately define being at work when we commit our being to offering intention.
So now to define prayer. Prayer is much more an umbrella term. And at its most basic level, prayer means communicating with God or with an intermediary or some supernatural power, whatever you call your higher being. It always recognizes the mediation or involvement of divine power in enabling what we will for. This involves listening as well as speaking, asking a question and being still, and may involve voicing a prayer, meditating, chanting, contemplation, dance, or other bodily expression. Now, there's some people who don't even like to interchange these words with prayer.
Yes.
We acknowledge that.
Yes.
Prayer may be very informal and conversational, and it can be extended to mean a continuing interacting with God, which may then always involve asking for something or willing for something to be. Indeed, one interpretation of the New Testament injunction in First Thessalonians to pray without ceasing is that prayer means being totally in contact with God, not separated from him or her, as is the case when we don't constantly open ourselves to receiving and moving in the Holy Spirit. In other words, rather than doing our own thing, we call upon a divine power within to work with, in and through us.
Mm,
This is important to me,
mm,
in and through us. The same desire to be constantly in constant communication with God is seen in the story of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and meeting with God, or the Isra Miraj, as it's known. Similarly, among other traditions, Sikhs are constantly exhorted to continually remember and meditate upon Guru, that is God.
mm. As said, in Christianity, prayer is usually spoken of as taking several forms, which include adoration, offering praise in awe and joy of God, confession, admitting our wrong, thanksgiving, thanking God, intercession, praying for others, and supplication or petition, asking for something, usually as a plea to God, either for ourselves or for others. In other words, supplication may include intercession, and similarly, intercession may involve making a plea or petition. These forms of prayer are also seen in other traditions. For example, Sydney-based Vaishnavism priest Sri Ramanuja Acharya says of Hindu prayer that in Sanskrit there are a number of terms used which are all translated as prayer, but that have different shades of meaning, many of which are not applicable to Western concepts of prayer. These include prarthuna, a formal request for service, help, favor, or protection; japa, the recitation of mantras; sutra, stava, and stuti, these being hymns or poems of praise or expressions of gratitude, which may or may not contain requests for assistance and intervention; and also abhivudana, statements of praise and salutation. Taking the teaching of the Catholic Catechism, prayer is the uplifting of the heart and mind to God. In other words, our heart plays an important part in the action in terms of that understanding. Prayers are typically done to, through, and in the name of Jesus, in the Christian tradition, of course, he being one of the three persons in the single triune God. God, the personal, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, we can go on,
Mhm.
omnibenevolent creator of everything, is, of course, front and center in Christian prayer.
Intercession or praying for others is usually what we have in mind when we use the terms prayer and intention in the same breath. Like intercession, intention sending is normally focused on what we will for others, although, of course, it can be for ourselves or for someone who is a member of our own circle that we are holding. In other words, what some people of faith may know as supplication. We shouldn't forget that praise also is a part of prayer, and giving thanks also features strongly in our intention work. This is the joyful aspect of this work when we have confidence that our prayers or intentions will be answered in the interest of the highest good of what we will for, or indeed when we learn that they have been answered.
Mm.
It is that wonderful, uplifting feeling of joy, which, if you believe in God, possibly brings us a small glimpse of the joy that the divine may feel when good things happen for God's people. And we also have to remember that, again, I'm going back to the science, when we're in those higher vibration energies of joy, gratitude, love, we're helping the field. We're bringing better emotions into the
Yes,
world. So it's
definitely,
important to embrace that.
definitely.
And science is proving that
Yes. It's strange,
for our
isn't
own
it?
well-being, even our bodies. We're learning how our bodies respond to that.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I love it actually when you get to hear things that are, you're not expecting. That actually happened yesterday. I was in a conversation with someone and they'd asked me a while back, can you pray, hold intention for someone that was in really quite a bad state and someone I didn't know. I had been doing that quite briefly, just one name among many in my daily prayers, and learned yesterday that they were out walking and seemingly coming through really worrying circumstances and again, someone you do not know, never seen or whatever, when you get to hear, oh, maybe, well, you don't think my prayer did that, but it's just good to know. Just good to know. Good to know.
Collectively, the energy,
Collectively,
is
exactly.
amplified.
It's made it, yeah, but just to know that there's been a happy story
Absolutely.
there. Yeah,
Absolutely. It opened your heart
it does.
and yeah,
Mm,
helped you.
definitely.
It's oh gosh, see now I'm always reverting back to the science, but it's the torus field of the energy around us. What you put out comes back to you.
Yes, absolutely. And as you say, it can be expansive. The more we put out, the more comes back, and the more keeps pushing out into the field, as it were,
Yes.
and touching
Yes.
others, and they in turn are,
Exactly.
uh, you
You
know,
reap what you sow. I mean, all of these terms that science is coming up with and we're finding can be found in the different scriptures.
mm,
And
mm,
all the different, religions have a version of you reap what you sow. What you put out comes back to you and all of that. So it's it's
exactly.
it's not alarming. It's not really new.
No, no,
It's just explanations.
it is. So we can see already, there's different definitions for prayer, different understandings, and as we said, we obviously respect those.
Hmm.
And this is the point. We come from slightly different perspectives, our listeners, I guess, and will have different understanding of what prayer means for them. But where do our thoughts, feelings, yearnings, energetic connections beyond normal consciousness originate? Normal waking consciousness, we might describe that. And how do they work together in intention sending and prayer? Now, we have to say right up front, this is a pretty tough question, and we're not necessarily going to be able to answer fully, and certainly not without taking a real deep dive beyond what we're doing now. But it's fascinating to start stripping away at where these questions may lead us, possibly giving us some insight into the nature of intention, and so possibly also into prayer. Let's start by returning to what Lynn McTaggart learned in her early work when searching for scientific explanations for homeopathy and spiritual healing, which she describes in her 2001 book, nearly 25 years old, The
Yeah.
Field. And she recalls that the scientific evidence that she had amassed with the field suggested something extraordinary and even disturbing. Directed thought had some sort of central participatory role in creating reality. Targeting your thoughts, or what the scientists ponderously refer to as intention and intentionality, appear to produce an energy potent enough to change physical reality. The simple thought seemed to have the power to change our world, she said. Her work pointed to what researchers identify as the 0-point field, which she says concern the extraordinary quantum field generated by the endless passing back and forth of energy between all subatomic particles. The existence of the field implies that all matter in the universe is connected on the subatomic level through a constant dance, as she puts it, of quantum energy exchange. And she went on to draw upon research into consciousness, which she says pointed her to well-designed experiments that suggested that consciousness is a substance outside the confines of our bodies, a highly ordered energy with the capacity to change physical matter, and directing thought as a target seemed capable of ordering machines, cells, and indeed multi-celled organisms like human beings. This mind over matter power even seemed to traverse time and space, and she began to dig up evidence that multiple minds trained on the same target magnifies the effect produced by an individual. And the evidence there suggesting that a group of like-minded thoughts created some sort of order in the otherwise random 0-point field. That was really her starting point, I think, for all the
Yes.
intention experiments, wasn't
Yes.
it, that
Yes. The
followed?
collective. Yeah.
The collective, indeed.
Yeah.
So as we know, a lot of science came out of that, following on from that
Yeah.
initial pointing in that direction.
And this is the piece that I love. Our listeners probably already figured that out if you've listened to our podcast a few times. But I do feel passionately about that. I mean, if we're talking about God being all those omni things, omnipresent, omnipotent, then of course this is true. Of course this is
Yes.
how this works for me. This is
Yes.
my belief. I
Yes.
don't want to impose this on anyone else, but it seems logical and exploitative to how this all works for me, the omnipotent part, that we're all
Absolutely.
connected.
I'm with you on that one. Definitely.
It's all
Mm.
God. It's
Yep.
all God.
It is.
So the implications are profound, as she puts it. Every thought we have is a tangible energy with the power to transform. A thought is not only a thought is a thing that influences other things.
Mm.
She noted that appreciating this, the central idea that consciousness affects matter, lies at the very heart of an irreconcilable difference between the worldview offered by classical and quantum physics concerning the very nature of matter and the way it can be influenced to change. And one thing I love about quantum physics is there's so much they don't understand. They're seeing what
Mm.
happens. They can't really explain a lot of it,
Mm.
but they're discovering it. She acknowledges the seeming scientific hearsay of all this, saying that the idea that consciousness creates and possibly even affects the physical universe also challenges our current scientific view of consciousness, which developed from the theories of the 17th century philosopher Rene Descartes. Mind is separate and somehow different from matter, and eventually embraced the notion that consciousness is entirely generated by the brain and remains locked up in the skull.
Mm.
That's the old way of thinking.
Mm.
From this, we might want to question the nature and role of consciousness in intention sending and prayer, and whether this is strictly something locked up in the skull, or at least being separate for each individual from the universal field. Is consciousness primarily about thinking and responding to what our physical senses are revealing to us? Or is something else at play? What is happening at the unconscious level or subconscious level when we are engaged in our practice? And what layers of consciousness may we have to access to?
Mm.
And we might question whether consciousness, while being invisible and not capable of being measured in any meaningful way, still has energy that plays out in the dance in the field. And we are starting to be able to measure consciousness.
Yes.
And that is what is exciting.
It's incredibly exciting time to be around, isn't it, with all this happening? And I think something else might be of interest is, this possibly the whole questions around consciousness might take us into the territory of what access we have to what Carl Jung described as the collective unconscious. Is that one and the same thing
Mm-hmm.
as the field, or does the field play a part in it? And also understanding how human consciousness has changed throughout human history. My understanding is that today we are meant, particularly in the Western world, to be much more locked up in the skull
Mm-hmm.
and see ourselves as separate from
Mm-hmm.
the way it used to be. So that may well be some rich territory to explore in future episodes there.
Well, and I think the exciting thing in all of this research and what we're finding is that we are powerful. Our consciousness has power, and we have a responsibility with that power. It's not just,
Mm, mm.
we're each our own sorcerer, like
Yes,
you said, working from the source. We are also responsible for how we relate to others. You
absolutely.
have to have both of those pieces together
Absolutely. And we have this
to improve
energetic
the world.
responsibility, as you say. Yeah,
Hmm.
definitely. And when we hear the terms and concepts offered by scientists such as at IONS, HeartMath Institute, and those involved in Lynn McTaggart's work, what they have to say about heart energy, and turn to considering matters of spirit, as it were, and the language that people of faith may more obviously relate to, we're interested to see what overlap may exist there. For those of faith, spirit is God given, and indeed for most is God. But could it be that the scientists are seeing something of a divine effulgence, an outpouring, as it were, an expression, when they turn their equipment to observing heart waveforms, puzzle over entangled particles, and more? This may be an intriguing question to contemplate. Of course, it's one that we are
Yes.
going to keep doing.
And they're not mutually exclusive,
No,
right?
exactly, exactly.
Yes. So we're going to wrap up this first part, leaving that question open. We hope, like us, you're finding this a fascinating exploration. So next time, we'll dig deeper into what the overlap between intercession and prayer may be, and whether or not the two can be thought of as one and the same. We hope you can join us then. But before we go, as we usually do, we want to suggest an intention that we might each hold over the coming week. So this week, as we've considered the nature of intention holding in prayer, we suggest holding as our main intention.
I resolve to acknowledge and give thanks when holding intention or offering prayer that my desire is powerfully communicated and reaches its intended receiver, irrespective of distance or time. Please join us in holding this. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this fascinating topic and hope this might open a discussion in the Facebook group. So please do share your thoughts there. We'd love to join in with those.
Absolutely, because we know you have some.
Yep, absolutely.
So that about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in Clive's daily Insight Timer offerings, and with me in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out, too, for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us and holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime,
thank you. Go well. Stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Binns and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.